more midterm results. The race in California's 21st district is even tighter, with Republican Congressman David Valadao leading Democratic challenger T.J. Cox by fewer than 450 votes. NBC News called this race for the incumbent after the initial results 3 weeks ago. The Democrats' lead in the national popular vote has now reached 8 points, continues to climb as more results are counted. And with President Trump back on the campaign trail, Politico is looking at the warning signs for his 2020 re-election bid. 3 items of note. President Trump is the only president whose approval rating has never passed 50% in the Gallup poll. Democrats made major gains in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which gave Trump an electoral college victory, and that the record turnout in 2018 suggests the president's supporters came out to vote and his party lost anyway. So, Donnie, look at a snapshot of 2018. Overlay that to 2020. What do you see?
Here's the other snapshot. Here's the other thing that's scary: is the economy is doing so well, and he is so over delivering as far as the economic numbers. As a positive 16, yet you put in a negative 11. There's a 27-point spread between what would happen is his popularity and the economy. When you are going up and against an economy that is going that strong and you lose that badly, and I want to go back to that 8%, that popular vote is a bigger margin than Obama either beat McCain or Mitt Romney by. Okay, that is a huge margin in a national election. So you say he lost by 8.5 points, the economy is booming, his popularity has never been above 50%. Right now it stands at 39%. And you say, what is going to be the good news over the next 2 years for him? I can give you a lot more bad news, starting with Mueller and ending with January when the Democratic Congress comes in. The backdrop for the next 2 years is going to be investigation after investigation. And Mueller will not even be his biggest problem with Russia. Biggest problem will be his businesses, will be his foundations. We have never had a president who comes to us with a history. If you think about Bill Clinton, if you think about Barack Obama, if you think about George W. Bush, they didn't come with a 30, 40-year resume of
public life.
Not just public life, of business hijinks, I will use for a nice word for it, that is going to kind of really, really be the backdrop of this presidency. So I can't see the news getting better for him.
So, Phil Rucker, what about that middle bullet point? It's something we talked about after Election Day, which is that the states that gave President Trump the presidency, that put him over the top by 78,000 votes when you string them all together, seemed anyway in this midterm election to have swung the other way on him.
Yeah, Willie, that's really significant, and those are 3 states that strategists at the White House and in Trump's re-election campaign are looking at very closely. They want to reverse that trend, obviously. They need to reverse that trend. Those are also states, by the way, that the president feels an emotional connection to from the 2016 campaign. He loves the fact that he made Pennsylvania red, that he made Michigan red, that he campaigned in Wisconsin and Hillary Clinton didn't. And so the fact that he lost, or that Republicans rather lost so badly in those 3 states really stings from this midterm campaign. And I expect in the early months of 2019 we're going to see the White House and the Trump re-election campaign try to make some political moves to build up his popularity there and put those states more in play for the re-election campaign 2 years from now.
Hey, Phil, let me ask you, you're the White House bureau chief, Washington Post. You know more than most people know. Jim Baker and Leon Panetta are not chief of staff. It's not a well-run White House. It's not a functioning White House the way we're used to White Houses being up to speed on the politics of the day. What's the sense within the White House, the preparation within the White House for the level of chaos that is about to ensue? I mean, the Mueller investigation is going to conclude at some point in time, maybe sooner rather than later. And the upcoming January 2nd Democratic Congress taking place, the House taking control of the House. What's the level of preparation, angst, fear, whatever, within the White House?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike, and I think they're pretty far behind, to be honest. And I think come January, Mueller's going to be not as big a concern for a lot of those in the White House as the House Democratic majority will be. There are going to be investigations left and right, and this White House is not prepared for them. The White House counsel's office is not fully staffed right now, and they're not. The staff are not have not experienced this before. They've never had an opposition party in control in Congress. They've had it pretty good for the last 2 years. years with Republicans controlling things on Capitol Hill, but they will not be able to, the White House will not be able to control these investigations, which are going to look into the president's personal finances, as Willie was getting into, but also into the family, into Ivanka's email use, for example, into corruption or allegations of corruption throughout the federal agencies. You look at Ryan Zinke, who's the Secretary of Interior, he's going to be a huge target. And so I think the White House is ill-prepared at this hour. They're trying to get ready for it, but they don't quite know what's coming.
Yamiche, we're going to have Jerry Nadler on the show in just a little while, one of the people who will be taking over when the Democrats, excuse me, take power in January. What's the White House, as you cover, the posture toward people like Jerry Nadler, toward people like Adam Schiff? How are they feeling now about a completely new Washington to them than the one they had over 2 years where they controlled every aspect of the government, now knowing that these subpoenas are going to be coming, there are going to be hearings and investigations? How concerned would you say the White House is right now?
I think the White House is very concerned. I think you only really have to go back to what the president said himself, which is that if the Democrats start to investigate me, it's really going to be game over, and I'm not going to want to work with them, because the president does not like the idea that he's going to have to be subject to Democrats' questions and to Democrats' subpoenas, either him or his children. There's this idea that maybe as president he won't have to respond to all of the questions that the Democrats have, but Ivanka, Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr. These are all people that are in the president's orbit that could potentially have ethics questions or ethics violations related to the work that they're doing, or even their existence in meeting with Russians. When you look at Donald Trump Jr., so I think there's a concern for the president to try to already play hardball and say, look, if you want to play this game, I'm going to basically shut down the government, shut down all deal making. But I think White House aides are also wondering, and I think they've been wondering this for a while: do we have any legal liability? Are we open to any legal action? I go back to Omarosa, who would frequently talk in meetings and say, hey, has anybody hired a lawyer yet? I've got my lawyer. Because there's this idea that people in that White House do not trust each other a lot of times and feel as though that they themselves need to be protected from whatever's coming down the road.
Yamiche, you raised the point about the White House not being prepared for this, but isn't it true to a certain extent that's okay with the president as well? Because from his perspective, yeah, he'll say, if they investigate me, I won't work with them. But he loves the idea of the foil. He loves the idea of this opposition that's now going to emerge with Democrats, because as he looks down the road to 2020, doesn't he see an opportunity to use them as a cudgel against themselves, to make himself the victim, and sort of put in context, in his context, how he sees these things, and the White House staff will just kind of fend for themselves in large measure?
Well, I think the president definitely will use the Democrats and all their investigations as a way to really have a talking point on the campaign trail. You can imagine that his stump speeches are going to be, look at all that they did in the 2 years that we gave them power. They're going to have all these, they're really after me. And I think what he's also going to say to his supporters is they want to delegitimize someone that you voted for. This has been what the president has been saying from day one, that you picked me and Democrats are mad, and as a result, they want to take away your rightful president and replace it with someone else. I think the problem, of course, is that if the Democrats come up with actual evidence, if there are actual indictments that come out of their investigations, it gets harder and harder for the president to say that these Democrats are just going after me if you have a Donald Trump who ends up maybe in jail or taking a plea deal.
So, Phil Rucker, different topic. You got your hands on this new book called Trump's Enemies, How the Deep State is Undermining the Presidency, written by Corey Lewandowski, the former campaign manager for the Trump campaign, and David Bossie, the former deputy campaign manager. Both remain informal advisors to the President of the United States. Who, in their estimation, are Trump's enemies?
Well, Willie, in their estimation, there are a lot of enemies embedded within the government, and they look at different areas. They look at the White House, and especially a number of former White House officials, but people like Gary Cohn, Rob Porter, Sean Spicer, the former press secretary. They consider these folks to be sort of working against the president, to either shift his style in some way or to stymie his agenda, aspects of his agenda that they don't agree with. But they also detail people on on Capitol Hill, not only the prominent Democrats like Adam Schiff, the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee in the House, but also some Republicans who they feel are trying to block the Trump agenda. And most importantly, I think for this book, they look at what they call the deep state, the intelligence agencies, the Department of Justice, the FBI, areas where they feel like officials are not only trying to block the president's agenda, but trying to delegitimize his presidency altogether. But these are not new names. I mean, the book is sort of the laundry list of the people that Trump has been going after on Twitter, and they put into book form a lot of the president's grievances that we're well familiar with at this time.
What's interesting, though, Phil, is that they do go after John Kelly, who's the sitting chief of staff in the book. They accuse him of caging the president and not letting President Trump be President Trump, which was always Corey's sort of line, got to let Trump be Trump. Is there any question in your mind that President Trump had some form of sign-off on this book? I mean, he obviously sat for an interview with it. These are not two men who would write a book that would cross President Trump.
No, and they don't cross President Trump in the book. I assume that the book is the product of some conversations that they've had with President Trump. And as you mentioned, there is that interview with Trump that's in the book. The pages are actually in sort of a bold tint. So as you're flipping through the book, you can be sure to find the interview pages. Very friendly interview, by the way. Look, Corey Lewandowski and Dave Bossie flew on the campaign, or on Air Force One, rather, with the president a number of times in the midterm campaigns. They talk a lot. And I think this book, while it's not written by President Trump, it certainly is influenced by him.
All right, Phil Rucker with the Reader's Digest version. Phil, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still ahead on Morning Joe. President Trump's lawyers hoped the Mueller investigation would be over around Thanksgiving. Last Thanksgiving. More than a year later, the president is just giving written answers to the special counsel's questions. We'll have the latest developments in the Mueller probe. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.